They tell you what happens when a guardsman deserts. They tell you what happens when a governor refuses the tithe. They tell you what happens when an entire world turns from the Emperor's light. But no one speaks of what happens when a space marine, a living weapon forged in gene-wrought flesh and psycho-indoctrinated will, simply says, no. Not to the enemy, not to chaos, but to his own chapter, his own brothers, his own sacred purpose. The Imperium was not designed to accommodate this possibility. The Adeptus Astartes recruitment process, the surgical modifications, the hypnotic conditioning, the cultural immersion in chapter tradition, every element exists to eliminate individual will as a meaningful variable. A Space Marine does not choose his actions any more than a bolter chooses its target. He is aimed, fired, reloaded. This is not cruelty. This is function. And yet, across 10,000 years of Imperial history, it happens. Not often, not predictably, but with enough regularity that certain protocols exist, buried in chapter archives and inquisitorial databases, to address the unthinkable scenario. A loyal Astartes who refuses his mission parameters. A warrior who breaks formation not because of corruption or cowardice, but because something inside the perfect machine has decided the machine itself is wrong. This is not the story of a traitor Marine seduced by the dark gods. This is not the tale of a chapter gone renegade in service of some imagined higher purpose. This is what happens when a single Space Marine, still loyal to the Emperor, still uncorrupted by any external force, simply stops obeying orders. What the Imperium does to him, what his brothers become. What he discovers about the nature of loyalty when loyalty itself fractures into incompatible demands. They call it the solitary heresy. The records are sparse, deliberately so, but they exist. Brother Captain Thane of the Iron Hands had served for 217 years when he received the orders that would end his life as he knew it. The mission parameters were standard pacification protocol, identical to dozens he had executed without hesitation. The world was Karvesht 7, a forge moon in the Thelema system that had fallen 3 weeks behind its munitions tithe. Local Mechanicus representatives reported labor unrest among the bonded work crews, efficiency dropping below acceptable thresholds. The Fabricator General had requested Adeptus Astartes intervention to restore compliance. Thane's company would deploy, eliminate resistance leadership, implement punishment protocols among the workforce, and reinstall proper production schedules. Estimated time to completion was 6 standard hours. Acceptable civilian casualties were listed as 30 to 40% of the manufacturing population, sufficient to traumatize the survivors into renewed obedience while preserving enough labor capacity to meet the tithe backlog. The briefing was delivered by Master of the Forge Cardon, who had served alongside Thane for nearly a century. The two had fought together on 17 separate campaigns, had stood back-to-back during the Orc Wog that shattered 2 neighboring systems, had shared the silence of post-battle maintenance rituals where warriors cleaned weapons and armor with the meditative precision their chapter demanded. They were not friends. Iron Hands did not permit such weakness, but they were brothers in the most functional sense, components in the same mechanism that served the Omnissiah's will. When Cardon finished the briefing and asked if there were any tactical concerns, Thane spoke 3 words that fractured reality more surely than any warp storm. I refuse this. The silence in the strategic chamber was not dramatic. It was simply a pause, while the other officers processed language that made no sense in context. Refuse was not a verb that applied to mission parameters. One could note obstacles, suggest alternate approaches, request additional assets. One did not refuse. Cardon's augmetic eye whirred softly, refocusing. Clarify your statement, Brother Captain. The mission parameters are inefficient and counter to optimal Imperial resource management, Thane said, his voice exhibiting no emotional inflection that might suggest emotional compromise. The labor unrest stems from malfunction in the Forge Moon's atmospheric recyclers, creating work environment toxicity above sustainable thresholds. The Mechanicus Tithe administrators have concealed this mechanical failure to avoid censure for poor equipment maintenance. Killing 30 to 40% of the workforce will not restore compliance because the physical cause of reduced efficiency will remain unaddressed. Additionally, given current sector-wide munitions demands, destroying skilled manufacturing labor represents strategic waste. He paused, then added the words that sealed his fate. I will not participate in this operation. I recommend we decline the mission and report the Mechanicus administrators for incompetence and dereliction. The reasoning was sound. The tactical assessment was accurate. But the conclusion violated something more fundamental than logic. Space Marines did not evaluate whether their orders were justified. They enacted them. The distinction between executor and judge was not merely cultural. It was biological, burned into their neural pathways through decades of conditioning. Thane had somehow bypassed this conditioning, not through corruption or outside influence, but through the same analytical processes his chapter prized for battlefield assessment. Master Cardon studied him for exactly 12 seconds, which meant his augmetic cortex was already running diagnostic scenarios. Your concern is noted, Brother Captain. However, mission parameters have been issued by Chapter Command, following proper authorization from the Adeptus Mechanicus. We will deploy as ordered. No, Thane said. We will not. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop, though this was physiologically impossible. The other officers, 3 sergeants and a tech marine, had gone completely still. The stillness of machines awaiting input on how to process corrupted data. You are refusing a direct order from Chapter Command, Cardon said, still speaking with the same neutral tone used for tactical discussion. This constitutes dereliction of duty under the Codex Astartes, Chapter Revised Protocol 773. You will submit to immediate psycho-evaluation and possible gene seed quarantine, pending investigation of potential corruption. I am not corrupted, Thane replied. I have assessed the mission parameters using the same analytical framework the chapter has trained me to employ for all tactical situations. The conclusion is unavoidable. This operation serves only to conceal Mechanicus incompetence while wasting Imperial resources. I will not participate in waste. The Iron Hand serve the Omnissiah through optimal function. This mission represents malfunction. It was the perfect Iron Hand's argument. Logic over emotion, efficiency over tradition. The cold calculus of machine optimization applied to human orders. And yet, by that very perfection, it revealed the flaw in the Iron Hand's philosophy itself. If you teach warriors to think like machines, to optimize all variables for maximum efficiency, what happens when their optimization calculations produce results their human commanders cannot accept? Cardon made a small gesture, and the 3 sergeants moved to positions flanking Thane. Not threatening, simply repositioning as protocols required when a brother showed signs of instability. You will accompany the chaplain for evaluation, Cardon said. This discussion is concluded. And that was when Thane drew his bolt pistol and shot the chamber's primary cogitator, destroying the tactical display and severing the room's connection to the ship's broader data network. The explosion of sparks and shattered ceramite was not loud. Bolt pistol reports never were, precisely engineered for efficiency over intimidation, but its symbolic violence exceeded any physical threat. "This discussion," Thane said, lowering his weapon but not holstering it, "requires conclusion on different terms. What happens next in a situation like this depends entirely on which chapter you belong to. Each of the 1,000 Space Marine chapters maintains its own internal discipline protocols, shaped by their founding legion's character and 10,000 years of cultural evolution. Some would have opened fire immediately, treating any refusal as evidence of corruption requiring instant termination. Others might have attempted extended dialogue, seeking to understand the malfunction before applying corrective measures. The Iron Hands, characteristically, did both simultaneously. Chaplain Vectis arrived in the strategic chamber within 90 seconds of the cogitator's destruction, summoned by automated alerts that triggered when a Space Marine discharged weapons in non-combat zones. He entered with his Crozius Arcanum already activated, the eagle-headed staff crackling with power field energy, but did not immediately attack. Instead, he positioned himself between Thane and the exit, blocking retreat while studying the brother captain with eyes that had witnessed 2 centuries of battlefield trauma and spiritual crisis. "Brother Thane," Vectis said, his voice modulated by his skull helm's vox to carry harmonic resonances designed to trigger calming responses in Astartes' neurology. "You stand in violation of your sacred oaths. Explain yourself, that I might understand the nature of your fall." "I have not fallen," Thane replied, and for the first time, something like emotion entered his voice, not anger or fear, but frustration at the failure of language to bridge conceptual gaps. "I have applied the principles our chapter teaches: weakness of flesh, strength of machine, optimization of function, elimination of waste. The mission I refuse serves neither the Emperor nor the Omnissiah. It serves only institutional pride and the concealment of Mechanicus failure. Is this not itself weakness? Is this not flesh thinking, allowing tradition and hierarchy to override logical analysis?" Vectis did not respond immediately. This was the danger of the scenario, the reason protocols existed. Thane's argument possessed internal logic that any Iron Hand could recognize as consistent with chapter philosophy. The Iron Hands had always walked a precarious line, venerating machine logic while serving institutions built on human irrationality. Most warriors never noticed this contradiction because their conditioning prevented them from examining orders with the same analytical rigor they applied to everything else. But occasionally, something slipped through the indoctrination. A warrior who thought too clearly saw too much. "The logic you present contains flaws," Vectis said, beginning the formal process of doctrinal correction. "You assess the immediate mission as wasteful. You do not assess the broader systemic implications of your refusal. What happens when warriors begin evaluating which orders to follow based on personal analysis? The Imperium fragments. Chain of command becomes meaningless. Chaos claims another institution through the root of individualism masquerading as reason. Your logic is the weakness, brother. You have replaced obedience to the whole with optimization for the moment. This is flesh thinking of the most insidious kind, the belief that your individual judgment supersedes collective necessity." It was a good argument, perhaps even a true one. But Thane had already moved past the point where arguments could reach him. "If my judgment is inferior to collective wisdom," Thane said, "then present me the collective's reasoning." Show me how killing workers who cannot breathe properly serves the Emperor better than repairing their air recyclers. Explain through logic, not through appeals to obedience. If you cannot, then the collective has no wisdom, only habit. And the flesh clings to habit, while the machine updates its functions based on new information. Behind Vectus, Master Cardan made another small gesture. The three sergeants raised their bolters, aimed at Thane's center mass. Not to kill. Ceramide armor would withstand several shots at this range, but to disable, to create opening for physical restraint. Thane saw the gesture, calculated trajectories and response times with the enhanced processing speed his multiple neural augmentations provided. He could fire on the sergeants, disable at least two before they could respond effectively. But that would be murder of brothers, the final unforgivable break. Or he could submit, accept evaluation, trust that his arguments would eventually be heard and considered by someone with authority to change mission parameters. He chose a third option that no one had anticipated. He activated his armor's vox on all chapter frequencies and began to speak. All brothers of the Iron Hands, hear me. I am Brother Captain Thane of 4th Company. I have refused a mission issued by Chapter Command, not from corruption, not from weakness, but from the application of the analytical principles our chapter teaches. We serve the Omnissiah through optimal function. I have identified suboptimal function in our command structure, and I cannot participate in waste. I do not ask you to join my refusal. I ask only that you consider whether obedience to flawed orders serves our purpose, or whether the machine of our chapter requires adjustment. It was less than 30 seconds of speech, delivered in the same neutral tone he used for tactical reports. But those 30 seconds propagated through the entire strike cruiser, reached every warrior preparing for deployment, every tech marine maintaining equipment, every scout trainee learning the ways of war. They heard a brother captain, decorated veteran of 2 centuries, speaking words that made sense by every measure of Iron Hand's philosophy, except one. They contradicted the chain of command. The sergeants opened fire. Thane's shields absorbed the first impacts, energy barriers flaring blue-white as bolt rounds exploded against them. But shield systems had limited duration, and armor had limited structural integrity. This was not a battle he could win. So he ran, not in panic, but with the calculated precision of a tactical withdrawal. He shot out the chamber's secondary door controls, forcing it to manual operation, which would delay pursuit by precious seconds. He dropped a frag grenade behind him as he entered the corridor, not to kill, but to create smoke and debris that would interfere with targeting sensors. And he moved toward the one section of the ship where protocols became complicated, where even a fugitive space marine might find temporary sanctuary. He fled toward the librarium, where the chapter's psychers dwelt in their shielded meditation chambers, and where the normal rules of violence and authority bent under the strange pressures of warp-touched minds. Epistolary Valen was 307 years old and had long since stopped thinking of himself as human in any conventional sense. The psychic augmentations, the force training, the decades spent with his consciousness partially extended into the immaterium, all of it had transformed him into something that wore an Iron Hand's body, but existed partially elsewhere. He felt the disturbance approaching his meditation chamber before any Vox transmission or alarm could reach him. A disturbance in the ship's emotional topology, the collective psychic field generated by hundreds of space marines, thinking and feeling in close proximity. Most of that field was quiet, disciplined, the mental equivalent of well-maintained machinery. But now a spike of panic and determination cut through the ambient calm, moving rapidly through the corridor network. When Brother Captain Thane arrived at the librarium's outer doors, Valen was waiting in the antechamber, out of his meditation trance, and fully armed with Force staff and Psychic Hood active. "You bring violence to a place of contemplation," Valen said. Not quite accusation, but definitely not welcome. Thane stopped precisely 3 meters from the librarian, far enough to demonstrate non-aggression, but close enough for conversation. Behind him, approaching footsteps and shouted commands indicated he had perhaps 30 seconds before pursuit overtook him. His armor showed scorching from sustained fire during his flight through the ship, and his left pauldron had been shot completely away, exposing the muscle-mimetic fibers of his underarmor. "I bring a question to a place of questions," Thane replied. "Is that not appropriate?" "Questions have protocol," Valen said. "Running from chapter command while broadcasting sedition is not protocol. I did not broadcast sedition. I broadcast logic. If logic is seditious, then we serve something other than truth." Behind Valen, deeper in the librarium, other psychers were emerging from their chambers, drawn by the commotion. 3 lexicaniums and another epistolary, all of them augmented and dangerous, all of them studying Thane with senses that could perceive far more than visible spectrum information. They would see his emotional state, his spiritual alignment, any taint of chaos that might explain his behavior. And they would find nothing, which would make the situation more rather than less dangerous. A corrupted Marine could be purified or destroyed. A Marine who broke protocol while remaining pure was a problem the Imperium had no clean solution for. The pursuit arrived with the efficiency of combat-trained warriors who knew the ship's layout by muscle memory. Chaplain Vectus, 3 sergeants, and now 2 full tactical squads, 20 Space Marines, arranged in formation that could cover all possible escape routes while maintaining clear firing lanes on the target. Thane was surrounded, cornered, and outgunned by approximately 50 to 1. He made no move to draw his weapons. Instead, he kept his attention on Valen, ignoring the threat at his back in a gesture that was either trust or fatalism. "Librarian Valen," Chaplain Vectus called out. "Stand aside. The brother captain is under censure and must be detained for evaluation." Valen did not immediately comply. Librarians occupied a strange position in chapter hierarchies. Necessary, but unsettling. Useful, but distrusted. Technically subordinate to command structure, but practically difficult to command. Their loyalty was never questioned, but their autonomy was broader than conventional warriors could claim. They saw things others could not, understood patterns invisible to non-psychers, and occasionally they acted on that understanding in ways that seemed arbitrary until hindsight revealed the wisdom. "What did you see?" Valen asked Thane, his psychic senses extending tendrils of perception toward the brother captain's mind, not invading, but sampling the surface thoughts. What pattern showed itself that the rest of us missed? It was a question no one else had asked. They had demanded explanation of his refusal, accused him of corruption, ordered his submission. But they had not asked what he had perceived that triggered this response. Librarians understood that sometimes perception preceded choice, that seeing differently created impossible situations where all options led to violation of some essential principle. Thane met the psycher's eyes, and for the first time since entering the librarium, he spoke not as a soldier, but as a person. I saw that we have become what we were created to destroy. Not chaos, not Xenos, but waste. Incompetence. The grinding of human beings into resources without consideration of efficiency or optimization. The Mechanicus administrators lied to conceal their failure. Chapter Command accepted those lies without investigation. And we, the Iron Hands, who pride ourselves on eliminating weakness, we were about to murder workers for the crime of suffocating. We were about to become the instrument of institutional cowardice. I saw this and could not participate. And now I am the enemy because I saw it. The words hung in the air, visible almost as physical objects to Valen's warp sight. Truth, as far as Thane understood truth. Not absolute truth. Such things were beyond mortal comprehension. But the truth of one warrior's perception, unfiltered by the defense mechanisms that usually protected Space Marines from seeing their service too clearly. He believes what he says, Valen announced to Chaplain. Valen announced to Vectus, translating his psychic assessment into words the non-psychers could process. There is no corruption, no external influence, no degradation of his gene seed. He has simply thought, and his thoughts have taken him somewhere the conditioning was designed to prevent. Then the conditioning has failed and must be corrected, Vectus replied. Stand aside, epistolary. This does not concern the librarium. But Valen did not move. He stood considering, his staff raised not quite to combat position but ready. His attention divided between the fugitive captain and the chaplain, who had issued a clear order. The moment stretched, pregnant with implications that would echo through chapter history, regardless of how it resolved. It concerns the librarium, Valen said finally, because the question he raises is valid. We serve the Omnissiah, and the Omnissiah is logic made manifest in machine. If logic leads to conclusions that contradict orders, which do we serve? The orders or the logic? Answer me that, Chaplain, and I will stand aside. It was the same trap Thane had set with his original refusal, rephrased through a librarian's spiritual authority. Vectus could not answer without either admitting that orders superseded logic, which violated Ironhand's doctrine, or agreeing that warriors could evaluate orders, which destroyed command structure. Any response created vulnerability. So Vectus chose the only escape available: violence before the question could propagate further. He activated his Crozius and charged, not at Thane, but at Valen, forcing the librarian to either fight a chaplain or submit to authority. It was ruthless, and probably saved the chapter from immediate fracture, because it transformed a philosophical crisis into a physical confrontation where protocols were clear. But Valen did not fight, and did not submit. He did something that only a psyker could do, something that rendered violence temporarily irrelevant. He opened a warp gate. The air in the librarium tore like fabric, and behind the tear was not the Imperium, in its pure chaos form, but a controlled channel, a tunnel through unreality, connecting this chamber to somewhere else on the ship. Valen had created an escape route, burning years of his own life essence to fuel the working, violating every safety protocol about unsanctioned warp manipulations aboard Imperial vessels. Go, he told Thane. The question you raise deserves answer. You will not find it here. Thane stared at the portal, at the death sentence it represented for Valen who had created it, at the impossible gift being offered by a brother he barely knew. He had not expected support. He had not expected anyone to understand. The librarian had given him something more dangerous than weapons or allies, validation that his question mattered. He went through the portal, and reality folded around him like closing teeth. The warp gate deposited Thane in the ship's substructure, deep in the maintenance crawlways, where servitors performed endless routine tasks and human crew almost never ventured. He materialized in a corridor barely wide enough for his armored bulk, surrounded by pipes and cables and the omnipresent hum of ship systems. Behind him, the portal collapsed with a thunderclap of displaced air, leaving no trace except the faint ozone smell of recent warp exposure. He had perhaps 10 minutes before tracking systems located him. The Iron Hands fitted all their warriors with multiple redundant locator beacons, integrated into armor and skeleton both. His flight could only be temporary, but temporary might be enough for what he needed to do, which was access the ship's restricted data archives and find evidence of how many times this situation had occurred before. How many other Space Marines, across how many other chapters, had reached similar conclusions. What happened to them? Whether any pattern existed that might suggest a systemic flaw rather than individual failures. He moved through the crawlways with the enhanced spatial memory his neurological modifications provided, navigating by mental map toward one of the tertiary data terminals that maintenance crews used for system diagnostics. These terminals had lower security protocols than command deck systems, accessible to anyone with basic Mechanicus authorization codes. And Thane, as a brother captain, possessed authorization codes that exceeded basic by several magnitudes. The terminal he found was built into a junction where 6 major power conduits intersected, its screen flickering with routine system monitoring data. He interfaced his armor's data port and began querying the ship's historical archives, searching for any previous incidents of Space Marine refusal of orders, any patterns of disciplinary action that might indicate he was not the first to experience this philosophical crisis. The data was there. Not hidden exactly, but distributed across multiple archive levels in a way that prevented casual discovery. The Iron Hands, he found, had dealt with approximately 1 case every 17 years for the past 3 centuries. Warriors who questioned orders, who attempted to optimize beyond their authority, who saw the contradictions in chapter philosophy and could not unsee them. Each case was handled individually, but the pattern was consistent. Psycho-conditioning reinforcement for first offenses, forced retirement to fortress monastery duties for second offenses, quiet termination for third offenses. 3 strikes and the machine recognized you as a malfunctioning component that could not be repaired. Efficient, logical, terrible. He was still reading when the first hunter-killer team arrived. They came in silence, moving through the crawlways with practiced efficiency, their armor's stealth systems masking most emissions. But Thane's enhanced hearing caught the faint whine of servo motors, the minute vibrations of ceramite scraping against metal. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached his position. He could fight, but fighting would end in his death, quickly or slowly, and would accomplish nothing except adding his name to the list of malfunctioning components. Or he could run again, deeper into the ship, perhaps finding some way to escape entirely, to reach one of the shuttlecraft and attempt planetary landing. Or he could transmit what he had found, broadcast it on all chapter frequencies as he had broadcast his original refusal. Force the entire chapter to confront the pattern of suppression, the evidence that his crisis was not unique but recurring, that something in the Iron Hands philosophy created warriors who eventually saw too clearly and had to be eliminated. He chose transmission, cued the historical data for broadcast, set his Vox to maximum power and all frequencies. His finger was on the activation rune when a voice spoke directly into his helmet's internal Vox, using a frequency that should have been impossible to access without his personal encryption codes. Do not! It was Librarian Valen, speaking through psychic means that bypassed technical communication systems entirely, projecting thought directly into Thane's consciousness formatted as speech. If you broadcast this, they will destroy every warrior who hears it. Information quarantine protocols. Anyone exposed to evidence of systemic flaw becomes potential vector for spread of doubt. You will kill hundreds of your brothers to make a point that will be erased from records before the next watch cycle. This is not the optimal path. Thane's finger hovered over the rune. What is the optimal path, Librarian? You opened a warp gate for me. You violated protocols to give me this chance. For what purpose, if not to expose the pattern? To give you time to choose differently, Valen replied, his psychic voice strained with the effort of maintaining the communication across ship distances without proper ritual preparation. The pattern you found is real, but the solution is not exposure. Exposure would lead only to purge. The Imperium cannot acknowledge systemic flaws without admitting its own fallibility, and that admission would destroy it more surely than any enemy. You must find another way, or you must accept that some truths cannot be spoken in institutions built on necessary lies. The hunter-killer team was 15 seconds away now. Thane could hear their whispered coordinations over squad vox, their movements converging on his position from multiple vectors. He had to decide, and the decision would define everything that followed. He removed his finger from the broadcast rune, deleted the queued data transmission, and turned to face his pursuers with his weapons holstered, arms spread in a posture of non-aggression. I submit to chapter authority, he said when they arrived, speaking the formal words that initiated surrender protocols. I request formal hearing before chapter master and assembled officers to present evidence in support of my refusal. It was a delaying tactic at best. Hearings could be denied, especially for warriors who had already demonstrated instability. But it was the only path that did not lead immediately to violence, and violence had become unacceptable the moment Valen suggested there might be another way. The hunter-killer team restrained him with maglocks, stripped his weapons, and escorted him through the crawlways toward the detention cells in the ship's secured section. They did not speak during the transport, and their body language conveyed only professional execution of duty. But one of them, a Sergeant Thane recognized from 3rd Company, made brief eye contact as they passed through a narrow junction. And in that moment of eye contact, Thane saw not hostility, but something that might have been understanding, perhaps even sympathy. The infection was spreading, he realized, not through his broadcast, but through his example. Other warriors were thinking thoughts they had not permitted themselves before, seeing patterns they had been trained to ignore. The question he had raised was loose in the chapter, and questions had no respect for information quarantine protocols. They propagated through inference and observation, through the simple act of warriors watching another warrior choose logic over obedience, and then being forced to consider what that choice meant. The Iron Hands had a philosophical virus, and Thane was patient zero. What the chapter did to him next would determine whether the infection could be contained, or whether it would metastasize into something that would transform or destroy the chapter from within. The detention cell was exactly what efficiency demanded. 3 meters by 3 meters. Bare ceramite walls reinforced with void shields. A single lighting panel that provided shadowless illumination. No furniture, no comforts. Nothing that might be weaponized or used for self-harm. Thane stood in the center of the cell, unarmored now. They had stripped him down to his basic body glove during processing, and waited for whatever came next. What came was not immediate judgment, but administrative delay. 6 hours passed with no contact, no food or water, though he needed neither urgently, no communication about when or whether his requested hearing would occur. The delay was itself a technique designed to create uncertainty and stress that would soften a prisoner's mental state. It worked on mortals. On Space Marines, it simply provided time to think, which was perhaps what Thane needed most, and what the chapter should have denied him least. He spent those hours reviewing everything that had led to this moment, analyzing his choices with the same rigor he applied to post-combat tactical assessments. The mission refusal had been logically justified, but strategically naive. He had thought clarity of reasoning would be sufficient, that presenting optimal analysis would force recognition of sub-optimal orders. This revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how institutions functioned. Institutions did not exist to optimize truth. They existed to perpetuate themselves, and truth was only useful insofar as it served that perpetuation. The Iron Hands were not machines despite their philosophy. They were humans who wore machine thinking as protective coloration, who used the language of logic to justify conclusions that served emotional and cultural needs. They needed to believe they were different from other chapters, more rational, more perfected. His refusal had threatened that self-concept more than it threatened operational efficiency. He should have understood this. His training had covered institutional psychology as part of strategic planning. Knowing how enemies thought was essential to predicting their actions. But he had never applied that training to his own chapter, never analyzed the Iron Hands with the same cold assessment he applied to orcs or traitors. Perhaps that was the real conditioning failure. Not that he had started thinking independently, but that he had started thinking honestly about the institution that shaped him. When the door finally opened, it was not Chaplain Vectus or Chapter Master who entered, but two figures whose presence suggested the situation had escalated beyond simple chapter discipline. One was a Space Marine he did not recognize, wearing unmarked black armor, with only a small inquisitorial rosette visible on the shoulder guard. The other was robed in red Mechanicus vestments, their body so heavily augmented that determining their original gender, or even species, was impossible without invasive scanning. "Brother Captain Thane," the unmarked Space Marine said, his voice modulated to neutrality, but carrying undertones of authority that suggested high rank. "I am Brother Interrogator Kane of the Death Watch, currently assigned to Ordo Hereticus investigation duties. This is Magos Investigator Helix 7 of the Adeptus Mechanicus. We have been granted temporary authority over your case by your chapter master, who has determined that your actions may indicate issues beyond internal chapter discipline." So they had escalated immediately to outside authorities. This was simultaneously better and worse than Thane had anticipated. Better, because it meant his case would not be simply buried through internal procedures. Worse, because inquisitorial involvement rarely ended well for anyone, guilty or innocent. "I have committed no heresy," Thane said, remaining at attention despite his unarmored state. "I have applied logic to mission parameters and found those parameters wanting. This is not corruption. This is function." "Function?" Magos Helix 7's voice emerged from a Vox grill positioned somewhere in their torso region. Processed through multiple filters that stripped it of emotional content. "You claim function while exhibiting classic symptoms of individual will superseding collective optimal. This is malfunction by Omnissiah protocol. Independent thought and component designed for subordinate operation creates system instability. Independent thought is exactly what the Iron Hands claim to value. Thane countered. Our doctrine emphasizes individual initiative, adaptive tactics, optimization of outcomes. I have done precisely what our training demanded. The only variable I introduced was applying that optimization to orders themselves rather than to execution of orders. And therein lies the heresy, Brother Interrogator Kane said, moving closer to Thane and studying him with eyes that had witnessed interrogations across dozens of worlds. You assume that because you possess capability to optimize, you possess authority to optimize all variables. This is the fundamental error of individual hubris. A warrior's purpose is defined by his position in hierarchy, not by his analytical capacity. You can think beyond your station. You cannot act beyond it without destroying the structure that gives your thinking purpose. It was the best articulation of the counter-argument Thane had heard, better than Chaplain Vectus's appeals to tradition or Valen's pragmatic warnings about exposure. Kane was arguing not from doctrine, but from systems theory, acknowledging that Thane's logic was sound, while demonstrating that sound logic applied at the wrong systemic level became destructive regardless of its internal validity. If I cannot act beyond my station, Thane asked, then who does possess authority to identify and correct flawed orders at the source? Who optimizes the optimizers? Chapter Master, Commander of Adeptus Mechanicus, Lord Inquisitor. The hierarchy extends upward through delegated authority to the High Lords of Terra, and ultimately to the Emperor himself. You have position in that hierarchy. You have role. You exceeded your role. This is the violation. And if everyone in the hierarchy exceeds their role in the same direction simultaneously, if the entire structure becomes optimized for self-perpetuation rather than for the original function it was created to serve? Magos Helix 7 emitted a burst of binaric cant that Thane's auto-translator parsed as something between laughter and critical error warning. You describe institutional drift, natural process. All systems degrade over time toward entropy unless constantly corrected. Imperium acknowledges this through doctrine of eternal vigilance. Your error is believing correction comes from individual judgment rather than from collective procedure. You identify potential malfunction. You report through proper channels. Proper channels investigate and implement correction if validated. Your report was valid. Your action was not. My report would have been suppressed, Thane said. The historical pattern shows. Brother Interrogator Kane raised a hand, cutting him off. You accessed restricted chapter archives during your flight. That constitutes another violation. You are not authorized to review disciplinary records of other warriors. The pattern you perceive may be artifact of incomplete data or selective sampling. You have constructed conspiracy theory from fragments, another symptom of individual judgment overriding collective wisdom. It was possible. Thane had to acknowledge that possibility. His analysis had been rushed, conducted under pressure, without the rigorous verification protocols proper investigation required. He might have found a pattern that did not exist, seen conspiracy and coincidence. The mind seeks patterns even in random noise, especially when under stress. But the possibility of error did not negate the certainty of what he had witnessed directly. Chapter Command. Accepting false Mechanicus reports without verification, issuing orders to commit wasteful violence, and then treating his refusal of those orders as heresy rather than as evidence requiring investigation. I request formal hearing before Chapter Master and assembled officers, Thane repeated. I will present my reasoning, accept independent verification of all claims, and submit to judgment based on evidence rather than procedural violation. Kane and Helix 7 exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them that Thane's unaugmented social processing could not interpret. Then Kane nodded slightly. "Your hearing has been scheduled," he said. "In 7 hours, you will be brought before an assembly consisting of Chapter Master, 2 captains, Chief Librarian, and Senior Mechanicus Representative. You will be permitted to speak. Evidence you wish to present will be evaluated, and judgment will be rendered according to procedures established by precedent and codex compliance. This is more consideration than your violations strictly merit, granted only because your service record suggests your malfunction may be correctable rather than terminal." They left without further words, the door sealing behind them with the hiss of pressure equalization. Thane was alone again, but now with confirmed timeline and procedure. 7 hours to prepare his case. 7 hours to find language that might bridge the gap between what he understood and what authority could accept. 7 hours to save his own life, and perhaps to prevent other warriors from facing the same impossible choice between logic and loyalty. The hearing chamber was not ceremonial space, but a tactical briefing room, hastily reconfigured with additional seating arranged in a semicircle facing a single empty chair where Thane would sit. The symbolism was clear. This was not a trial with presumption of innocence, but an investigation of malfunction with presumption of guilt pending evidence to the contrary. They brought him in still, unarmored, escorted by 2 Terminators, whose massive forms bracketed him like mobile bulwarks. The assembled authorities watched his entrance with expressions ranging from open hostility to carefully maintained neutrality. Chapter Master Vec sat central position, his centuries of service visible in the scars that decorated every visible surface of his skin, and the dozen augmetic replacements that comprised significant portions of his skull and torso. To his left sat Captain Storn of 2nd Company and Librarian Valen, whose presence was surprising given his earlier assistance. To his right sat another Magos, this one wearing the full regalia of a fabricator locum, and a figure Thane had not expected, an inquisitorial representative in full formal robes marked with the symbols of Ordo Hereticus. "Brother Captain Thane," Chapter Master Vec began without preamble, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of someone whose larynx had been replaced 3 times due to combat damage. "You have been granted hearing as requested. Present your justification for refusing lawful orders, accessing restricted archives, fleeing lawful arrest, and forcing a librarian to commit procedural violations in assisting your flight. You have 1 hour. 1 hour to justify decisions that felt self-evident, but which every authority structure in the Imperium was designed to reject." Thane sat in the designated chair, folded his hands in his lap, and began with the only argument that might have any chance of success: institutional self-interest. "Chapter Master, assembled officers, I acted not against the Iron Hands, but in service to its core function. Our chapter exists to embody the strength of machine logic over flesh weakness. I applied that logic to mission parameters and found them catastrophically flawed. The Forge Moon Karvesh VII was not experiencing labor unrest due to workforce defiance. Mechanical examination of the facility's atmospheric recycler systems would have revealed toxicity levels incompatible with sustained human operation. The Mechanicus administrators knew this, concealed it, and requested our intervention to eliminate witnesses to their incompetence. Had we executed the mission, we would have murdered Imperial workers while leaving the root cause unaddressed, resulting in continued production failures and wasted tithe resources. He paused, gauging reactions. Chapter Master Vec showed nothing. Captain Storn was frowning but listening. The Inquisitor's expression was completely hidden behind an ornate mask that displayed only stylized human features. Librarian Valen, notably, was nodding almost imperceptibly. I refused because executing that mission would have made us complicit in Mechanicus incompetence and wasteful of Imperial resources. Both outcomes violate our chapter's core purpose. I am prepared to provide detailed analysis demonstrating that alternative approaches would have better served both immediate tactical goals and long-term strategic interests. The question I pose to this assembly is not whether my refusal was procedurally correct. I acknowledge it violated protocol. The question is whether protocol should override optimal function when the two conflict. It was the same trap he had set before, rephrased slightly, forcing the assembly to either affirm that procedures mattered more than outcomes, which violated Iron Hand's philosophy, or agree that warriors could evaluate orders, which violated command structure. Fabricator Locum spoke next, their voice emerging from multiple Vox grills in overlapping harmonies. Your assessment of atmospheric toxicity is correct. Investigation subsequent to your refusal has confirmed mechanical failure in Carvesh 7 recycler systems. However, your conclusion that alternative approach would have been superior requires counterfactual analysis that cannot be verified. The mission you refused might have succeeded. Your alternative might have failed. Optimization requires measurable outcomes, not theoretical projections. Agreed, Thane said, which is why I requested investigation before execution, not cancellation of mission entirely. I did not refuse to serve. I refused to serve blindly. You refuse to trust your superior's judgment, Captain Storn interjected, his voice carrying barely restrained anger. You elevated your assessment above that of chapter command, who possess broader strategic perspective and greater experience. This is not optimization. This is arrogance. It would be arrogance if my assessment had been wrong, Thane countered. But investigation confirmed accuracy. At what point does accurate assessment cease to be arrogance and become simply correct? The inquisitorial representative spoke for the first time, their voice processed through the mask's vox to sound neither male nor female, but something artificially modulated to perfect neutrality. Brother Captain Thane, your logical analysis contains a subtle but fundamental error. You assume that correct is a property of assessments that can be verified independently of institutional context. But correctness in Imperial service is not determined by correspondence to external reality. It is determined by alignment with authorized interpretation of reality. A warrior who reaches accurate conclusions through unauthorized analysis is more dangerous than one who reaches wrong conclusions through proper procedure, because the former creates precedent for independent judgment, while the latter can be corrected through existing systems. It was the most honest articulation of Imperial epistemology Thane had ever heard spoken aloud. Truth was not about reality. Truth was about authority. And any truth discovered outside authorized channels was by definition suspect, regardless of its accuracy. So I should have been wrong through proper procedure, rather than right through improper analysis, Thane said slowly, testing whether he had understood correctly. You should have reported concerns through proper channels, and accepted the determination of those channels regardless of outcome, the Inquisitor clarified. Your role is not to be right. Your role is to fulfill your function within the system that gives your existence meaning. Librarian Valen stirred, his psychic hood humming softly. With respect to the inquisitorial representative, that formulation creates logical paradox. If a warrior's function is to optimize outcomes, but he is forbidden from optimizing beyond his authorized scope, then we have created warriors with capabilities we forbid them to use fully. This is machine design flaw, providing system with greater processing capacity than its operational parameters permit. The excess capacity, Chapter Master Vec said, speaking for the first time since his opening statement, is deliberate. Space Marines must be capable of independent action when separated from command structure during combat operations. We cannot create warriors so constrained by procedure that they fail when communication is lost or commanders are killed. But that independence is bounded. It applies to tactical execution, not to evaluation of strategic directives. Brother Captain Thane extended his independence beyond its intended scope. The question before this assembly is whether that extension was temporary malfunction correctable through reconditioning, or terminal deviation requiring his removal from active service. So there it was, the two options on the table. Reconditioning, psychosurgery that would strip away whatever neural patterns had allowed him to think beyond his designated bounds, or removal, which was euphemism for execution, or at minimum exile to some remote watching station where his philosophical virus could not spread. Before you decide, Thane said, knowing this was his last chance to shift the frame of discussion, I request permission to present evidence regarding the frequency of this malfunction within the chapter's historical records. I believe it occurs with sufficient regularity to suggest systemic cause rather than individual deviation. Chapter Master Vec's eyes narrowed, which was the only expression his heavily augmented face could still produce. You accessed restricted archive during your unauthorized flight. That material is sealed for reasons you are not cleared to understand. Request denied. Then I request Librarian Valen be permitted to provide psychic testimony regarding the pattern he has observed during his 3 centuries of service. Librarians perceive truths others cannot. If he has witnessed similar cases, his testimony would validate that this is not isolated incident, but recurring issue, requiring institutional response beyond individual correction. All eyes turned to Valen, who had gone very still in the way Psychers did, when their attention was divided between physical space and warp perception. After a long pause, he spoke. I have served this chapter for 307 years. In that time, I have witnessed 17 cases of warriors who questioned orders with sufficient intensity to trigger disciplinary procedures. 12 were resolved through reconditioning. 4 were removed from active service. 1 resulted in voluntary exile after the warrior concluded he could not reconcile his conscience with chapter demands. All cases followed similar patterns. Experienced warriors with exemplary service records, high intelligence ratings, strong analytical capabilities. All reached conclusions that our doctrine should permit, but our command structure could not accept. The admission fell like ordnance into the assembly. Even the Inquisitor shifted slightly, a tell that suggested this information was news to them as well. This supports conclusion of systemic cause, the fabricator locum observed, their multiple Vox grills creating strange harmonies. 17 cases across 3 centuries suggests approximately 5 incidents per century, or 1 incident every 17.8 years. Pattern consistency indicates design flaw in either recruitment, training, or conditioning protocols. Recommend comprehensive review of chapter procedures to identify and correct malfunction source. But Chapter Master Vec shook his head, servo motors in his neck whirring softly. 17 cases across 3 centuries from a chapter of approximately 1,000 warriors represents less than 2% deviation rate. This falls within acceptable tolerances for any system operating at our complexity level. No design is perfect. All machine systems include tolerance margins for acceptable failure. The question is not whether the pattern exists, but whether Brother Captain Thane's specific case falls within parameters for correction or requires disposal. No, Thane said, standing despite not having been given permission to do so, forcing the Terminators flanking him to shift position in preparation for restraint. The question is whether a 2% failure rate is truly acceptable when the failure mode involves eliminating your most analytically capable warriors. You lose warriors who can think beyond protocol, which means you optimize your chapter for obedience at the expense of intelligence. Over centuries, this creates evolutionary pressure towards simpler thinking, more rigid doctrine, less adaptability. You are deliberately breeding out the capability you claim to value. We are maintaining operational consistency, Captain Storn shot back. A chapter that permits warriors to question orders becomes a chapter that cannot function in extended campaigns where chain of command is essential. Your proposed solution would destroy us more surely than any enemy. My proposed solution, Thane said, his voice rising despite efforts to maintain control, is to investigate orders before executing them when evidence suggests those orders are flawed. I am not proposing anarchy. I am proposing intelligence. The difference is stark. The difference, the Inquisitor said, their modulated voice cutting through the increasing tension, is that your proposal requires individual judgment of what constitutes evidence of flawed orders, and individual judgment is precisely the vulnerability that chaos exploits. Today, you refuse orders because atmospheric recyclers are broken. Tomorrow, another warrior refuses orders because he believes the strategic objective is suboptimal. The day after, a third warrior refuses because his personal interpretation of the Emperor's will differs from his commander's. Where does legitimate analysis end and corruption begin? How do you draw that line? It was the unanswerable question, the one Thane had wrestled with during his hours in the detention cell. Where was the line? At what point did healthy skepticism become corrosive doubt? When did optimization become betrayal? He had no answer that would satisfy the assembly, but Librarian Valen did, speaking quietly but with absolute certainty. The line is drawn at corruption of purpose. A warrior who refuses orders while remaining aligned with the Emperor's true purpose has not fallen, merely erred. A warrior who refuses orders because he has adopted purposes alien to Imperial service has become enemy. Brother Captain Thane's purpose remains uncorrupted. He wishes to serve the Emperor and the Omnissiah with maximum efficiency. He simply perceives different path to that service than his commanders specified. This is error of method, not corruption of intent. Therefore, reconditioning is inappropriate response. Destruction is excessive response. The correct response is recalibration, assignment to role where his analytical capabilities can be utilized without threatening command structure. It was a masterful intervention, providing the assembly with a third option that avoided both the violence of execution and the admission of systemic flaw that accepting Thane's position would require. Create a special category for warriors like Thane, some role where their dangerous independence could be channeled into useful work while removing them from normal operational chains where their influence might spread. Chapter Master Vec considered this for exactly 15 seconds, his augmented mind running calculations that probably included game theory analysis of all possible outcomes. Then he spoke his judgment. Brother Captain Thane, you are hereby removed from command position and from operational service within this chapter. You will be reassigned to the Death Watch where your analytical capabilities may be utilized in Xenos combat operations under different command structure. This assignment is permanent. You will not return to the Iron Hands. Your name will remain in our honor rolls, but your physical presence will not. You are exile, not traitor. You may retain your gene seed and armor, but you are no longer our brother in any sense except historical. Do you accept these terms? It was exile, but exile with honor, with continued purpose, with possibility of future service, even if not with his birth chapter. It was more than he had any right to expect, given the severity of his violations. I accept, Thane said, because the alternative was death, and death served no purpose. Then you are remanded to custody of Brother Interrogator Kane, who will transport you to Death Watch facilities for integration. This hearing is concluded. The assembly rose and departed without ceremony, leaving Thane with the two Terminators and the growing realization that he had simultaneously won and lost. He would live, would serve, would potentially even find vindication someday if his analytical approach proved valuable in Death Watch operations. But he would never return home. Never stand beside Iron Hand's brothers in battle. Never be part of the culture and tradition that had shaped him. He had refused an order and survived. But the cost of that survival was everything that made survival meaningful. 3 years later, Brother Captain Thane, now simply Brother Thane of the Death Watch, stood in the kill team briefing chamber aboard Watch Fortress Ariok, receiving mission parameters for a Xenos elimination operation on the edge of Ultima Segmentum. Around him stood 5 other Astartes, each from different chapters, each with their own histories and reasons for Death Watch service. 2 were exiles like him, sent by their chapters for offenses less severe than treason, but too severe for simple reconditioning. 3 were volunteers, warrior scholars drawn to Death Watch by genuine interest in Xenos combat rather than by necessity. The briefing was delivered by a watch captain whose chapter insignia had been painted over, his identity subsumed into the Death Watch collective identity. He spoke with casual authority, outlining objectives and tactical considerations, with the assumption that his warriors would execute without question. It was the same assumption every commander made, the same bedrock faith in obedience that Thane had shattered 3 years earlier. And as Thane listened to the briefing, he noticed something in the mission parameters that troubled him. A small detail, possibly meaningless, possibly significant. A discrepancy in the intelligence reports, suggesting that the Xenos presence they were being sent to eliminate might not actually exist, that the mission might be predicated on false data intended to achieve some purpose other than Xenos containment. He noticed this, analyzed it, reached preliminary conclusions that the mission might be flawed, and said nothing. He had learned his lesson, or perhaps he had simply broken in the way the Imperium needed him to break. He had retained his analytical capabilities, but lost the will to act on them when they contradicted command. He had become a better deeper space marine by becoming a more broken human. The mission proceeded as briefed. They deployed to the target world, swept the identified zones, found no Xenos presence, filed report noting the intelligence error, and returned to the Watch Fortress. The watch captain thanked them for their service and immediately assigned them to a new operation, never acknowledging the wasted resources or the possibility that the faulty intelligence had been deliberate. And Thane said nothing. Again. This was how the Imperium survived. Not through perfection, but through an infinite capacity to absorb individual failures and simply continue. It ground down warriors who questioned it, not through direct suppression, but through the slow erosion of will that came from repeatedly discovering that being right changed nothing. Eventually, you stopped being right. It was more efficient. But late that night, in the private quarters all Death Watch members maintained for meditation and maintenance, Thane accessed the Watch Fortress archives and began reviewing historical records of questionable missions. How many times had intelligence errors led to wasted operations? How many times had Death Watch warriors been deployed for purposes that had nothing to do with their stated objectives? Did any pattern exist that might suggest systemic issues with how the Death Watch received and evaluated mission intelligence? He was investigating again, thinking again, seeing patterns again. He had not learned the lesson. He had simply learned to hide the fact that he was still asking questions. And somewhere in the fortress, in chambers dedicated to psychic monitoring, a librarian whose duties included observation of all warriors for signs of corruption or instability, made note of Brother Thane's unusual data access patterns. The note was filed, cross-referenced, forwarded to appropriate authorities, protocols engaged. The machine recognized a component showing signs of the same malfunction that had led to his exile from the Iron Hands. The cycle would repeat. Question, investigation, refusal, exile, until eventually there was nowhere left to exile him to, no organization that would accept a warrior who could not stop thinking. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and war requires warriors who will fight without asking why. Those who ask why do not survive long, not because they are killed, but because they are removed from all contexts where their questions might matter. They are made irrelevant through administrative procedure, neutralized without the dignity of open conflict. Brother Thane sat in his quarters, reviewing data on flawed missions, constructing evidence that would never be presented to anyone, and wondered if this was victory or defeat. He had survived his refusal. He was still serving the Emperor, still fighting humanity's enemies, still nominally an honored Space Marine. But he was alone with questions that had no answers, in an Imperium that could not tolerate the asking. And the most terrible realization was this: the Imperium was probably right. If every warrior who noticed flaws began refusing orders, the entire structure would collapse into individualist chaos that would doom humanity more surely than any Xenos threat. The machine required components that functioned even when the machine itself was flawed. Sacrifice of individual judgment was the price of collective survival. He understood this, accepted it intellectually, but could not stop seeing what he saw, could not unsee the patterns once noticed, could not become blind again, no matter how much more efficient blindness would beg. So he would continue, serve, question, document, hide, waiting for the day when his hidden questions accumulated sufficient evidence to matter, or the day when his questioners became tired of his existence and simply ended it. Either outcome would be acceptable. Because he had learned one thing from his refusal and exile: a Space Marine who could not stop thinking was already dead in all ways that mattered to the Imperium. He was just waiting for his body to acknowledge what his purpose had already recognized. The Imperium had 10,000 Space Marines who would fight without question. It did not need the one who would question without fighting.